Welcome back to Creepy Horror Stories. Tonight, we invite you to step into the quiet, sun-drenched streets of the 1950s. But as you will soon discover, even the most perfect dream can be hollow on the inside. Prepare yourselves for our original feature, the compression of reality. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Every morning of mine begins with a perfectly pressed shirt waiting on the back of a chair. In Levittown, time feels frozen in the golden ratio. The front lawn is trimmed to a fraction of an inch, and the scent of fresh coffee and bacon mingles with the faint aroma of furniture polish. My wife, Mary, is always smiling, smoothing the hem of her dress while I check to see if the napkins are perfectly aligned on the oak table. There is no room for chaos or dust in our lives. Every object has its strict place, and every minute has its purpose. It is the American dream, sealed inside a vacuum-tight glass orb where absolute sterility reigns. Today, I decided to tidy up the basement where the tools and old cans of paint are kept. I headed downstairs, enjoying the cool touch of the concrete. Near the far wall, tucked behind a shelving unit filled with canned goods, sits a utility closet door. I remembered distinctly that behind it lay nothing but a solid brick foundation wall. When I turned the metal knob and pushed the door open, my body went numb. There was no brick behind the threshold. Instead, an identical basement stretched out before me with the same lighting, the same jars of tomatoes, and the perfectly clean shelves. It was my basement, but turned inside out, leading deep into a space that should not exist. I stepped across the threshold. My shoes hit the exact same flooring. I climbed the stairs, feeling a strange dryness in my mouth. Stepping into the kitchen, I saw a percolator on the stove. Steam rose from it in a thin spiral, and the air held that same scent of dark roast beans. I walked over and touched a cup. It was hot. Today's newspaper lay on the table, folded exactly as I had left it 10 minutes ago. The house was empty, yet it felt lived in, as if Mary had just stepped into the next room. I went back to the basement, my heart working hard but rhythmically. I opened the utility door in this new house. Behind it was another corridor, then another. And the third house was an exact replica of the second. And the fourth, a copy of the third. I walked through these concrete portals, and each new space greeted me with absolute silence and the scent of a perfect life. It reminded me of those endless rows of mirrors in a barber shop, where reflections get smaller and smaller until they vanish into a single point. The chain of houses seemed infinite, and each one was ready to receive its master. I stopped in the fifth house. Something had changed. I walked over to the fireplace, where our wedding photo always sits on the mantel. I picked up the frame, and my fingers involuntarily shuddered. Mary's figure and mine were there, but our faces had begun to lose their clarity. Our eyes looked like dark smudges that had slightly run downward, and our smiles had turned into indecipherable pink strokes. The paint in the photograph felt wet, though my fingers remained dry. The interior details around me were losing their sharpness. Too, the wallpaper pattern had become simpler, and the edges of the furniture looked as if they had been lightly sanded down, erasing their distinct curves. I left the distorted photo behind and moved on to the living room of the sixth house. A bookshelf caught my eye. I reached for my favorite collection of short stories, but when I flipped it open, a wave of nausea hit me. The pages were bone white. There were no page numbers, no titles, just a smooth blank canvas of paper that smelled like chalk. I grabbed a fresh newspaper from the coffee table. Instead of the usual columns about politics and sports, a long gray smear stared back at me. The printer's ink seemed to have dissolved, leaving behind only a faint hint that text had once existed there. The world around me was losing its information, turning into a hollow stage set with no script. Anxiety finally beat out curiosity. I bolted for the front door, hoping to run out into the street, see the neighbors, or at least feel the sun. I grabbed the knob and yanked, but the door did not even budge. It was not locked. It felt like it was part of the wall itself, a monolithic slab that only mimicked an entrance. I peered through the window, but all I could see behind the glass was a thick, motionless white fog pressing tight against the frame. The street was gone. I realized that the only space available to me was limited by these walls, and the only way to move was through that utility door in the basement, either back toward the original or deeper into the unknown. By the time I reached the eighth house, the silence had become physically heavy. I had never noticed how many sounds fill a life. The ticking of a clock, the hum of the fridge, the distant barking of dogs. And now, all of it had vanished. The air felt still and oppressive, as if I were inside vacuum packaging. The only thing I could still hear was the dull thud of my own heart echoing in my temples. The sound felt too loud, too alive for this dead place. The world around me had fallen silent, refusing to maintain the illusion of life anymore. The 10th house greeted me with a fracture in my perception. The colors that were once the pride of our suburb had faded. The bright red upholstery of the armchairs had turned a muddy gray, and the green wallpaper had shifted to the color of wet ash. I ran my hand along the wall and jerked it back. Instead of cool, a smooth plaster, I felt a coarse, porous surface that felt like cheap packing cardboard. The house was not even trying to be real anymore. It had become a crude replica made of low-quality material that barely held its shape. In the next transition, the degradation hit the very structure of things. I walked into the kitchen, feeling a pang of hunger, but froze in the middle of the room. There were no plates or knives on the table. Where the kitchen cabinets should have been, there were now flat surfaces without a single seam or indentation. The handles were gone. The refrigerator had turned into a large metal rectangular block without a door. Objects were losing their purpose, becoming monolithic chunks of matter. I touched the stove. It was cold and felt like a solid piece of some unknown polymer, completely devoid of burners or switches. I moved into the next hall, which had once been my living room, and felt the back of my neck go cold. At the far end of the corridor, near the bedroom entrance, a silhouette flickered. It moved awkwardly, in jerks, as if frames of an old film strip were dropping out of reality. I stopped, holding my breath, hoping to see Mary or a neighbor, anyone alive, and the figure froze. As I slowly approached, the light hit what I had taken for a man. It was a crude likeness of a human, molded from the same gray substance as the walls. He had no fingers, only rounded stumps, and instead of a face, there was a smooth, slightly convex surface without a single hint of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. The figure stood motionless, head tilted at an unnatural angle. There was more menace in that stillness than in any movement. The space began to resist my presence. In the 13th house, the walls no longer held right angles. They leaned inward, forming a sharp funnel. The ceiling dropped so low that I had to crouch, feeling the rough texture of the cardboard against the top of my head. The hallway, which usually spanned just a few feet, had stretched out into an infinite perspective. I walked for minutes, but the door at the end did not get any closer, as if distance itself had become elastic and was expanding under my feet. Time lost its synchronization with my steps, and every second spent here felt like an hour. When I finally reached the kitchen of the 14th house, my elbow brushed a glass sitting on the edge of the counter. It did not fall. The glass slowly drifted sideways and hovered in the air as if in zero gravity. The water inside spilled out, but it did not splash. It gathered into perfectly round, transparent spheres drifting before my face. I poked one with my finger, and it stayed stationary, ignoring the laws of gravity. Objects no longer had mass. The world had lost its weight, turning into a collection of visual ghosts held by nothing to the planet's surface. The 20th house had almost completely lost its connection to reality. There were no walls, windows, or doors in the traditional sense. The entire space consisted of smooth white cubes of varying sizes. One large cube stood where the bed used to be. A few smaller ones mimicked chairs. There was no light source, no lamps or windows. Yet everything glowed with a flat, cold radiance emanating directly from the surfaces themselves. It looked like an unfinished 3D model, where the creator had left only the basic volumes, never bothering to add a single detail. I stood in the middle of this white void, feeling like my own body was a far too complex and out-of-place object in this primitive world. A sudden horror, sharp and cold, pierced my mind. I realized, if I took one more step, I might dissolve myself. I spun around and bolted back. I ran through the white cubes, through the warped corridors and the weightless droplets of water. My lungs burned. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break my chest. I burst into each subsequent utility room without stopping, never looking back at the gray, faceless figures that now appeared in every house. Each transition was an act of desperation, an attempt to catch a reality that was slipping through my fingers with every door I threw open. I burst into the basement of the first house, gasping for air and praying for the cool touch of real concrete. The stairs creaked under my feet, a sound that felt like the sweetest music in the world. I ran into the kitchen, shouting for Mary, but the words died in my throat. My wife stood by the stove, clutching an empty white rectangular block that had once been a percolator. When she turned toward me, I recoiled. Her face was not a face anymore. It was a smooth mask of raw dough, with two perfectly circular black pits where her eyes should have been.
你妈，你妈，你妈。
The original had been poisoned by degradation. The infection of simplification had reached the very beginning of my world. I froze in the middle of the living room, staring at my hands. My fingertips were losing their prints and becoming perfectly smooth. In that moment, a cold, inevitable realization hit me. I am not a man of flesh and blood living in a 1950s suburb. I am just a unit of information, a file in a massive archive that someone, or something, decided to compress. All my life, Mary, this perfect house, and every detail in it are just data points losing bits with every processing cycle. I was witnessing my own fading, the compression of my soul into a basic algorithm that no longer required details to exist. Suddenly, the sense of resistance beneath my feet vanished. The living room floor began to crumble, not into wood splinters, but into tiny black and white squares. Matter was breaking down into pixels, revealing an infinite black void underneath. I was not falling anymore. I was simply suspended in a space where up and down had ceased to exist. The walls of the house, which once seemed immovable, it dissolved into a cloud of digital dust. Gravity, the last law tying me to the illusion of reality, it finally dissolved into the emptiness. Frame zero flashed before my eyes. It was an absolute, a primal darkness, devoid of any light or hope. I saw the 0 point, the moment before the projection of my life was first launched. It was the beginning and the end all at once. A blank canvas where my destiny had once been painted and was now being methodically erased with a coarse sponge. I watched as the last fragments of my perfect suburb vanished into this darkness like ash scattering on a wind that did not exist. I was left alone. My body was the last detailed point in this vast nothing. I felt my thoughts getting shorter, as words, color names, and the names of loved ones vanished. I became noise, a brief static spike in an infinite series of identical, non-existent rooms. The last bit of my consciousness flickered out, and I finally became part of the background vibration of an empty universe, where nothing happened anymore.
Thank you for listening until the very end. This was an original story, written exclusively for this channel. Now, I have to ask you, if you found a door in your home that led to an identical world, would you have the courage to step through? Or would you keep it locked forever? Leave a comment with your thoughts and share your theories on what truly happened to the world in this story. We love reading your takes. If you enjoyed this descent into madness, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new nightmare. Be sure to check out our other videos for more bone-chilling tales. Until next time,